I stood behind the kitchen door clutching a glass of ice water. When I heard my father say that this year they had to embarrass me so badly, I would never show my face again, I did not cry. I did not step out. Instead, I smiled. For the first time in 40 years, I held the one thing my family feared most. They thought the Christmas party was a stage to bury me, but they did not know I had come to rewrite the script. My name is Chloe Jones, and for the last 15 years, the drive back to Maple Glen, Ohio, has felt less like a homecoming and more like a voluntary surrender to a hostile state. The sky was a bruised purple as I navigated the winding roads that led to the affluent suburbs, the kind of place where the lawns are manicured to within an inch of their lives, and the silence is heavy with judgment. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel of my 7-year-old sedan, a vehicle I kept specifically for these visits. It was reliable, nondescript, and screamed mediocrity, exactly what my family expected of me. I pulled into the driveway of the Hawthorne residence at 6 o'clock sharp. The house was a sprawling colonial revival, illuminated by tasteful, warm white floodlights that cost more to run for a month than most people spent on groceries. It looked perfect. It looked prosperous. But I knew better. I took a deep breath, the cold December air filling my lungs, and steeled myself. I was here to perform a duty, to play the role of the disappointing eldest daughter one more time. When I entered the dining room, the stage was already set. The mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine, was laid out for four. My father, Gerald Hawthorne, sat at the head, radiating an aura of impatient authority. My mother, Linda, fluttered nearby, adjusting silverware that was already perfectly straight. My younger sister, Tessa, was already seated, scrolling through her phone with the casual indifference of someone who knows she is the main character. I moved to take my usual seat, but I paused. The geography of the table had shifted. My chair had been pushed down slightly, creating a subtle but undeniable distance between me and the rest of the family. It was a matter of inches, but in the Hawthorne household, inches were miles. Then I looked at the place setting. In front of Gerald, Linda, and Tessa sat the good china, the Lenox pattern with the gold rim that had been in the family for 3 generations. In front of me sat a plain white ceramic plate, the kind you buy in a stack of 10 from a discount store. It was chipped on the rim. I looked at my mother. She did not meet my eyes. She busied herself with a napkin, her voice light and airy as she delivered the first cut of the evening. "Oh, Chloe. Don't mind the mix-up," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "The good plates are for guests and special occasions. We didn't want to risk breaking another one. And since it's just family dinner, I figured you wouldn't care. I wasn't a guest. I wasn't special. And apparently, I wasn't worth the risk of a broken plate. It is fine, Mother," I said, my voice steady. I pulled out my chair and sat down. The wood felt cold against my back. Gerald didn't look up from his carving of the roast beef. "You are late," he stated, though the grandfather clock in the hall had just chimed the hour. "I arrived at 6 exactly." "Dad," I replied politely. "Traffic," he grunted, dismissing my punctuality as an accident. He served Tessa first, placing a prime slice of meat on her gold-rimmed plate. Then Linda. Then himself. He gestured vaguely toward the platter for me to serve myself. The remaining pieces were dry and overcooked. So Gerald began, the word landing like a gavel on the table. He looked at me with eyes that were hard and assessing the eyes of a man who measured worth in net assets and job titles. "Still doing that advising thing, or have you found a real job yet?" I cut a piece of the dry beef. "My consulting business is steady, Dad. I help companies restructure their internal workflows." "Consulting," he scoffed, the word dripping with disdain. "That is just a fancy word for unemployed people who own a printer. You are 41 years old, Chloe. By your age, I had already expanded the dealership to 3 locations. You're drifting. It is embarrassing to explain to my friends at the club what you do. I usually just tell them you are finding yourself. Tessa laughed. It was a sharp tinkling sound that grated on my nerves. She took a sip of her wine, an expensive Cabernet that I noticed was not poured for me. Don't be mean, Daddy, Tessa said, though her smile said otherwise. Not everyone is cut out for the high life. Speaking of which, did I tell you about the commission check from the riverfront property? $50,000. Just for one closing. She turned to me, her eyes gleaming with false sympathy. You should really look into real estate, Chloe. I could probably get you a job as a receptionist at my firm. Pays $18 an hour. That is probably more than you make with your little consulting gigs, right? I chewed slowly, forcing myself to swallow the food that tasted like sawdust. That is a generous offer, Tessa. But I am happy where I am. Happy? Gerald muttered, shaking his head. Happiness does not pay the mortgage. Happiness does not build a legacy. Look at your sister. She just came back from Aspen. Where did you stay again? Tess. The St. Regis. Tessa beamed. It was $1,200 a night, but totally worth it. The service was impeccable. We had a private instructor for the slopes. You should have seen the snow, Chloe. It was pure white. Not like that slush you probably have in the city. I sat there, the invisible punching bag, absorbing the blows. This was the ritual. I was the baseline against which they measured their success. I was the failure that made their mediocrity shine like gold. In my head, I recited the balance sheets of my 3 holding companies. I thought about the transaction I had authorized that morning, moving $4 million into a secure trust. I thought about the penthouse I owned in Columbus, the one with the view of the Scioto Mile, paid for in cash. But I said nothing. I smiled the polite, tight-lipped smile of the defeated. Sounds lovely, I said. I'm glad you had fun. It was more than fun, Tessa corrected. It was a lifestyle. The dinner dragged on for 45 minutes. 45 minutes of subtle jabs about my clothes. My sweater was quaint and my hair and my lack of a husband. The heat in the room began to rise. Or perhaps it was just the pressure building behind my temples. The air felt thick with their self-congratulation. I need some water, I said abruptly, standing up. My glass had been empty for 20 minutes, and no one had offered to refill it. Tap water's in the kitchen, Linda said, not looking up from her plate. Don't use the bottled stuff in the fridge. That is for the party tomorrow. Or, I said. I walked out of the dining room, my heels clicking softly on the hardwood. I pushed through the swinging door into the kitchen, letting it close almost all the way behind me, leaving just a sliver of open space. I moved toward the sink, turning on the faucet to mask any noise I made. But I didn't fill the glass immediately. I leaned against the cold granite counter, closing my eyes, trying to regulate my breathing. That was when I heard it. The dining room acoustics were strange. If you stood in the right spot in the kitchen, specifically near the butler's pantry, the voices carried as if the speakers were standing right next to you. She looks terrible. Tessa's voice drifted in, clear and cruel. Did you see that sweater? It looks like she bought it at a garage sale. She has given up, Gerald said. The sound of his knife scraping against the china made me wheeze. That is why we have to do this. She needs a wake-up call. A harsh one. Are you sure about tomorrow night, Gerald? Linda asked. Her voice was hesitant, but not in defense of me, only in fear of a scene. It seems excessive. It is necessary, Gerald insisted. We are going to present the Family Legacy Awards. Halfway through the night, Tessa gets the Achievement Award, and then we call Chloe up. I froze. My hand hovered over the faucet handle. We call her up for the potential award. Tessa giggled the sound malicious. And then Dad gives the speech. The one we practiced. I am going to tell the truth, Gerald said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl. I am going to say that while some children soar, others sink. I am going to announce that we are setting up a charity fund in her name to help struggling adults who cannot launch. I want the whole town to know we are supporting her charity case lifestyle. It paints us as saints and puts her exactly where she belongs, beneath us. The whole town will laugh at her, Linda murmured. They will pity us for having to carry her. Exactly, Gerald said. Shame is a powerful motivator. Maybe once she is the laughingstock of Maple Glen, she will finally listen to me and take that receptionist job. I want her broken, Linda. I want her pliable. I felt the blood drain from my face. My grip on the empty glass tightened until my knuckles turned white. They weren't just being mean. This was a calculated assassination of my dignity. They wanted to strip me bare in front of 200 of their closest friends and business associates. They wanted to weaponize their charity to destroy me. I needed to move. I couldn't just stand there. I turned to fill my glass. My movements as mechanical through the crack in the door. I saw movement. I shifted slightly to get a better angle. Gerald had stood up from the table. I need more wine, he announced. He didn't go to the wine rack. He walked to the heavy oak sideboard against the far wall. I watched as he moved a decorative vase aside and pressed a hidden panel in the way scouting. Clicked open. A wall safe. I had grown up in this house and I had never known that safe existed. Gerald looked over his shoulder, checking if Linda or Tessa were watching. They were busy looking at Tessa's phone. He spun the dial. The combination was quick. 3 numbers. He pulled the heavy steel door open. He didn't take out wine. He reached in and pulled out a thick stack of documents bound in a blue folder. He flipped through them frantically, his face glistening with a sheen of sweat that had nothing to do with the roast beef. He looked terrified. He pulled a single sheet out, stared at it, muttered a curse word I rarely heard him use, and then shoved it back in, slamming the safe door shut. He smoothed his jacket, composed his face into a mask of arrogance, and grabbed a bottle of wine from the rack nearby. My heart hammered against my ribs. Gerald Hawthorne was afraid. My father, the man who walked through life like a god, was terrified of what was in that blue folder. I turned away from the door, my mind racing, and nearly dropped my glass. Mrs. Delaney was standing right behind me. I hadn't heard her enter from the mudroom. She was a small woman, 60 years old, with hands roughened by decades of scrubbing floors that she didn't own. She had worked for my parents for 30 years. She had bandaged my knees when I fell off my bike, and she had wiped my tears when Gerald screamed at me for getting a B on a report card. She stood there in her gray uniform, holding a tray of dessert spoons. She looked at the crack in the door, then at me. She had heard. She had seen me watching. Panic flared in my chest. If she told them I was spying, the element of surprise was gone. But Mrs. Delaney didn't speak. She didn't scold. Her eyes, usually cast down in deference to my parents, met mine with a fierce, burning intensity. She shifted the tray to one hand and reached out, squeezing my arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong. She nodded just once. A sharp, decisive dip of her chin. It was a message. I saw it, too. You are not crazy. You are not alone. Then, without a word, she turned and busied herself with the coffee maker, creating a wall of noise to cover my return. I exhaled a breath I didn't know I was holding. I filled my glass with ice water. The cold stung my fingers. I drank it in one long gulp, letting the freeze numb the burning rage in my gut. I wasn't Chloe the failure anymore. I wasn't the daughter who needed a receptionist job. I was the CEO of Meridian Advisory Group, I was a woman who specialized in hostile takeovers and corporate restructuring. My family thought they were planning a roast. They didn't realize they had just invited a predator to dinner. I pushed the kitchen door open and walked back into the dining room. "Took you long enough," Tessa drawled. "Did you get lost?" "Just enjoying the tap water," I said, my voice smooth, devoid of any tremble. I sat down on my hard chair. I looked at the chipped plate. I looked at Gerald, who was pouring wine with a hand that shook ever so slightly. "So, Dad," I said, picking up my fork, "tell me more about the legacy you are building. Sounds fascinating." I ate the rest of my meal. I nodded at the right times. I smiled when Tessa bragged about her new BMW. I played the part perfectly. But inside I was already moving pieces on a chessboard they didn't even know existed. When dinner ended, I declined dessert. "I have an early start tomorrow. Elite. I want to be rested for the party. Make sure you dress appropriately," Linda called out as I walked to the door. "Nothing thrift store chic." "Don't worry, Mother," I said, pausing at the threshold. "I will be dressed to kill." I walked out into the biting cold of the Ohio winter. The wind whipped my hair across my face, but I didn't feel the chill. I got into my car, the leather seat freezing against my legs. I didn't start the engine immediately. I sat in the darkness watching the golden glow of the house where my family plotted my destruction. I pulled my phone from my purse. It was a burner phone, one of two I carried. I dialed a number I had saved for a worst-case scenario. It rang twice. Yet, a voice answered. Sharp, professional. "It is Chloe," I said. "Activate the file immediately." The drive back to Columbus took 2 hours, and I spent every minute of it decompressing. Peeling off the layer of submissive daughter I wore like a suffocating second skin. By the time the skyline of the city appeared, glittering against the black velvet of the night, I was 41 years old again. I was not the disappointment. I was not the charity case. I was a ghost. And ghosts are terrifying because you never see them coming until you are already haunted. My apartment building was a sleek needle of glass and steel piercing the downtown sky. A place where privacy was the most expensive amenity on the lease. I drove my battered sedan past the valet stand. The attendants knew me well enough not to wheeze at the rust on the bumper. They knew that the woman driving the car that sounded like a lawnmower was the same woman who tipped them $100 every holiday, and whose parking spot was on the secure underground level reserved for the penthouses. I parked the car in the shadows of Pillar 4C, right next to a black Italian sports car that cost more than my parents' entire house. That car belonged to me, too. I just never drove it to Maple Glen. The elevator ride to the 45th floor was silent and swift. When the door slid open, I stepped into my sanctuary. The lights flickered on automatically, revealing a space that would have made Tessa weep with envy. It was minimalist, cold, and unapologetically expensive. Florida-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city I had conquered. But the most important feature of the room was the silence. Here, nobody interrupted me. Nobody told me I was chewing too loudly. Nobody asked why I was not married. I tossed my keys onto the marble kitchen island and poured myself a glass of vintage scotch. Neat. I needed the burn to wash away the taste of that dry roast beef and the bitter memory of my father's voice to the world and specifically to the Hawthorne family. I was Chloe the drifter. Chloe the consultant who scraped by on small contracts and lived in a rented studio apartment on the bad side of town. They believed this because I let them believe it. I had crafted my mediocrity with the same precision a sculptor uses to chip away marble. It started when I was 17. I could still feel the phantom sting of that afternoon in the sunroom. I had spent 6 months building a portfolio for a graphic design scholarship. I had poured my soul into charcoal sketches and digital layouts, believing with the naive optimism of a child that talent mattered. I brought it to my father, hoping for a nod, a word of validation. Gerald Hawthorne had flipped through the pages with greasy fingers, leaving smudges on my work. He laughed. It was a dry hacking sound. He told me that doodling was for children and people who wanted to starve. He asked if I planned to pay my bills with pretty pictures. He called it trash. Then he looked at my mother. Linda Hawthorne had been standing by the window, arranging leaves in a vase. She saw the tears welling in my eyes. She saw the way my hands shook as I reached for my drawings. She could have said the work was beautiful. She could have told him to stop. Instead, she turned her back and adjusted a stem that was already perfect. That silence broke something in me. It also built something new. I realized then that in the Hawthorne house, vulnerability was a death sentence. Any talent I showed would be mocked unless it made Gerald money or made the family look good. So, I decided to be nothing. I learned to hide my grades. I learned to downplay my achievements. I became the gray rock in the garden, unnoticed and unbothered. The only person who saw through the act was my grandmother, Rose Bennett. She was my mother's mother, a woman who had buried 3 husbands and kept her own bank accounts until the day she died when I was 18 and packing my bags to leave for a state college my father refused to pay for. Grandma Rose pressed a check into my hand. It was for $5,000. Real power does not make noise, Chloe, she had whispered, gripping my hand with fingers that felt like dried twigs. The loudest man in the room is usually the most frightened. You be quiet. You be smart. And you never let them know how much you have in the reserve tank. I took that $5,000 and I took her advice. I worked 3 jobs in college. I ate instant noodles.
I år trift store clothes.
Not because I had to, but because I was saving every penny to buy freedom. When I graduated, I didn't go into graphic design. I went into finance. I discovered I had a knack for seeing the cracks in a business before the foundation collapsed. Now 20 years later, I was the sole owner of Meridian Advisory Group. We didn't just consult. We were the cleaners. When a corporation was bleeding out, I would walk in, fire the incompetents, restructure the debt, and strip the rot away. I was ruthless. I was efficient. I made millions by being the person who could look a CEO in the eye and tell him his baby was ugly and dying. I had 3 separate holding companies to keep my name off the public records. My real estate portfolio included commercial warehouses in 3 states and apartment complexes in the developing districts. I was not just comfortable. I was wealthy in a way Gerald Hawthorne could only dream of. But I kept the old car. I wore the sweater from the discount rack to dinner because if they had even the slightest inkling of what I was worth, they would not just be jealous. They would be parasites. Gerald would demand I bail out the dealership. Tessa would expect me to fund her lifestyle. They would claim my success was somehow their doing, that their tough love had pushed me to greatness. I would rather burn the money than let them take credit for it. I walked to the wall behind a large abstract painting in my living room. I slid the canvas aside to reveal a wall safe. Unlike my father's anxious, sweaty fumble earlier that evening, my movements were calm. I entered the 8-digit digital code and the heavy door hissed open. Inside there were stacks of cash, passports, and hard drives. But I reached for the thick manila envelope labeled Hawthorne. This year. I had started investigating my parents' finances 6 months ago. It wasn't out of malice. Initially, it was professional curiosity. Gerald had made a comment at Easter about market volatility that didn't sit right with me. It was the specific jargon of a man repeating what a loan officer had told him, not a man who understood the market. I sat down on my white leather sofa and spread the documents out on the glass coffee table. The picture they painted was not of a prosperous local business dynasty. It was an autopsy of a financial disaster. The car dealership, the crown jewel of Gerald's ego, was leveraging debt to pay debt. The revenue had dropped 40% in the last 2 years as online retailers ate his market share. Instead of adapting, Gerald had doubled down on expensive local television ads and showroom renovations he couldn't afford. I picked up the property title search I had commissioned last week. This was the smoking gun. The house in Maple Glen. The colonial revival with the warm white floodlights and the good china had been refinanced 3 times in the last 5 years. There was practically zero equity left in the property. They were living inside a hollow shell. Then I saw the document that made my blood run cold. Not with fear, but with a dark, satisfied understanding. It was a notice of default on a bridge loan taken out against the business 6 months ago. The interest rate was predatory. It was a desperate move by a desperate man and the co-signer. I shuffled the papers until I found the signature page. There it was in looping. Arrogant cursive: Tessa Hawthorne. Tessa, who bragged about $50,000 commissions and $1,200 hotel rooms, had tied her financial neck to the sinking stone that was our father. She probably didn't even read what she was signing. She never read anything. She just liked the feeling of being important enough to be asked. I sat back, the scotch warming my chest. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with a satisfying snap. The family legacy awards, the speech, the public humiliation they had planned for me tomorrow night. It wasn't just about being cruel. It was a distraction. It was a smoke signal. Gerald needed to project strength. He needed the town, the bankers, and his investors to believe that the Hawthorne family was as solid as bedrock. By juxtaposing Tessa, the successful heir, against Chloe, the failure, he was creating a narrative of continuity and prosperity. He was showing the world that the business had a bright future in Tessa, hiding the fact that the present was bankrupt. They were going to use my humiliation to buy themselves another 6 months of credit. I looked at the numbers again. The loan that was currently choking them, the one Gerald had been sweating over in his safe, was held by a mid-sized regional bank called First Ohio Trust. It was a distressed asset. Banks hated distressed assets. They wanted them off their books before the fiscal year ended. I knew the vice president of risk management at First Ohio Trust. We had played tennis together at a charity gala 2 months ago. I had advised him on a merger the previous year. I picked up my phone. It was 9:30 at night, but in my world, business did not sleep. I sent a text to my lawyer. Margaret, the property in Maple Glen, the commercial note on the dealership. Verify the holder is First Ohio. If it is, I want to buy the paper. All of it. A minute later, the phone buzzed. Margaret, that is a lot of toxic debt. Chloe, you will be buying a sinking ship. Why? I typed back, my fingers flying across the screen. I am not buying the ship. I am buying the anchor. I looked out at the city lights again. My father thought he was the director of this play. He thought he could write me into the role of the tragic clown. But he had forgotten the first rule of business. The one rule Grandma Rose had understood better than anyone. You never start a war with someone who owns the bank. I took a sip of scotch. The documents on the table were no longer just paper. They were ammunition. Tomorrow night, I would walk into that party. And I wouldn't just be a guest. I would be the owner of the venue, the lights, and the very ground they stood on. I put the glass down and picked up the photo of the good china I had snapped surreptitiously at dinner. I zoomed in on the gold rim. It looked tacky under the harsh light of my screen. Let them have the plates. I would take the table. The morning sun had barely crested over the Scioto River when my phone vibrated against the marble countertop. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. I stared at the screen. The caller ID flashed. Tessa. I let it ring 3 times before picking up. In my line of work, you never answer on the first ring. It implies you were waiting. Hello. Tessa. I answered, keeping my voice thick with sleep, playing the part of the disorganized sister who struggled to wake up before noon. Chloe, rise and shine. Tessa's voice was too bright, too loud, and saturated with a synthetic sweetness that made my teeth ache. I am just calling to remind you about tonight. You know, the party starts at 7. But Mom really wants everyone there by 6:30 for family photos. You know how Dad gets about punctuality. I remember, I said, cradling my coffee mug. 6:30. And Chloe? She paused, a giggle bubbling up in her throat. Make sure you wear something decent. Dad has a special presentation planned. He's going to call us up on stage. It is going to be a really big moment for the family. I would hate for you to feel out of place. The special presentation, the ambush, the public execution of my dignity. I will be there. I said. I would not miss it for the world. Great. Love you. Bye. She hung up before I could respond. I set the phone down. The screen went black, reflecting my face. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like a hunter who had just checked her traps. I finished my coffee in 3 swallows, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit that I would never wear to Maple Glen, and took the elevator down to the garage. I didn't take the sedan this morning. I took the black sports car. I was heading into battle and I needed armor. My destination was a glass tower 3 blocks away from the State House. The law offices of Callahan Associates occupied the top 2 floors. This was not a firm that advertised on billboards or bus benches. This was the kind of firm you only knew about if you had a net worth in the 8 figures or a problem that required surgical precision to remove. Margaret Callahan was waiting for me in Conference Room B. Margaret was a woman carved from ice and granite. She was 50 years old with silver hair cut into a sharp bob that could probably cut glass. She wore a suit that cost more than my father's car. She was the best corporate attorney in the state, and she was the only person in Ohio other than my grandmother who knew exactly who I was. Chloe, she said, not rising from her seat. She gestured to the leather chair opposite her. On the table between us sat a single thick file. Coffee? No. Let's get to it. I sat down. The room smelled of lemon polish and expensive leather. I pulled the trigger on the acquisition request you sent last night. Margaret began opening the file. Her fingers were long, manicured, and devoid of jewelry. First Ohio Trust was more than happy to unload the debt. It turns out your father is not just a valued customer. He is a liability. The loan officer I spoke with sounded relieved. Apparently the Hawthorne account has been flagged for monitoring for 3 months. Define monitoring? I said missed payments. Margaret replied, sliding a document across the table. Late fees and a very frantic attempt to restructure the principal loan 2 weeks ago which was denied. I looked at the document. It was a purchase agreement for a non-performing note. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was simple. So, we are buying the debt, I said. Technically, a limited liability company called Winter Hallow Holdings is buying the debt, Margaret corrected. A company that lists a blind trust as its beneficiary. Your name appears nowhere on the public filing. As far as the bank is concerned, they are selling a bad asset to an aggressive debt acquisition firm. They get 60 cents on the dollar. They clear their books before the fiscal year ends and they walk away. It is a win for them and for us. For us, Margaret said, her eyes narrowing slightly behind her rimless glasses. It means that as of noon today, you are no longer Chloe Jones, the disappointing daughter. You are the bank. You own the mortgage on their house. You own the lien on the dealership land. You own the equipment financing. She tapped the paper with her index finger. You own the air they breathe. I picked up a pen. The weight of it felt good in my hand. However, Margaret said, her voice dropping an octave, stopping my hand midair. There is something else you need to see. During the due diligence phase this morning, which was rushed, per your instructions, my forensic accountant found something in the original loan application your father submitted last year. She flipped a page. It was a copy of a financial statement signed by Gerald Hawthorne. Look at line 14. Margaret commanded. I looked. It was the valuation of the dealership's inventory. $3 million. I read aloud. Correct. Margaret said. Now look at the audit report from the manufacturer dated the same week. She slid another paper over. $1.2 million. I whispered. Your father inflated his assets by nearly 200% to secure the loan. Margaret stated flatly. That is not creative accounting, Chloe. That is bank fraud. Federal bank fraud. If this file goes to the district attorney, Gerald Hawthorne is not just looking at bankruptcy. He is looking at 3 to 5 years in a federal penitentiary. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the fraudulent document. It was bold, confident, the signature of a man who thought he was untouchable. He lied to get the money. I said he risked prison to keep up appearances. People do desperate things when they are drowning, Margaret said. But that is not all. The loan required a personal guarantor because the business credit was already overextended. Gerald didn't have the liquidity to back it alone. He needed a cosigner with a clean credit history and verified recent income. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I knew what was coming, but hearing it confirmed was different. Tessa, I said. Tessa Hawthorne, Margaret confirmed, sliding the final document across the polished wood. She pledged her personal assets as collateral, her condo, her investment accounts, her future commissions. She signed right next to him. I looked at my sister's signature. It was full of loops and hearts over the I, like a high school student signing a yearbook. She had signed away her life to prop up his lie. Does she know? I asked. Does she know he cooked the books? Hard to say. Margaret shrugged. Ignorance is a defense, but it is a weak one when you are the guarantor. Even if she stays out of jail, if we foreclose, she loses everything. She will be destitute. Her credit will be ruined for 7 years. No more real estate license. No more luxury trips. I leaned back in the chair. The room was silent, save for the hum of the HVAC system. This was no longer just about stopping a humiliation at a party. I held a nuclear code. I could obliterate them. I could send my father to prison and leave my sister homeless with a single phone call. It is a lot of leverage. Chloe, Margaret said softly. Ethically, as your attorney, I have to ask, what is the endgame here? If you foreclose, you destroy them. Is that the goal? Total annihilation. I looked out the window. I saw the city below, the cars moving like ants. I thought about the potential award they were planning to give me. I thought about the chipped plate. I thought about 40 years of being told I was nothing. But I also thought about my mother, Linda. She hadn't signed these papers. She was a victim of his ego, too. Even if she was a complicit one. And Mrs. Delaney. If the house went, she had nowhere to go. No, I said, turning back to Margaret. I do not want to destroy them just for the sport of it. I am not him. This is not about cruelty. It is about accountability. For the first time in their lives, they are going to face the consequences of their actions. I reached for the 2 binders Margaret had prepared at the edge of the table. I want 2 tracks prepared, I said, my voice hardening. Go on, Margaret said, uncapping her pen to take notes. Track 1, I said, tapping the blue folder. Restructuring. We offer them a lifeline. We keep the wolf from the door. But on my terms. Strict financial oversight. An allowance. He steps down from control of the business. He stops the spending. He stops the lies. It is a prison. Yet, but a comfortable one. And track 2? Margaret asked. Track 2 is the red folder, I said. Foreclosure. Immediate calling of the note. We report the fraud to the authorities. We seize the assets. We enact the personal guarantee against Tessa. What triggers track 2? Margaret asked. If they fight me, I said. If they try to spin this, if they refuse to take the hand I am offering because they are too proud to admit they fell, or if they proceed with what they have planned for tonight after I warn them. Margaret nodded. She understood. She respected power. And she respected restraint even more. Very well, she said. I have the transfer documents here. Winter Hallow Holdings will officially become the holder in due course once the wire hits. The purchase price is $2.8 million. Are you authorized to release that amount from the trust? Do it, I said. Wire the funds. I signed the papers. My signature was nothing like my father's or my sister's. It was small, sharp, and eyelable. It was the scratch of a pen that finalized a verdict. The wire will clear within the hour, Margaret said. Gathering the papers. I will have the electronic notification sent to your secure server. By the time you walk into that party tonight, you will be the landlord. I stood up and buttoned my jacket. One more thing. Margaret, I said. Yes. I want a copy of the fraud evidence. The inflated inventory report. Put it on a secure flash drive. Margaret raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. She walked to her computer, typed for a moment, and then ejected a small silver drive. She handed it to me. Be careful with that, she warned. That is not leverage. That is a loaded gun. I know, I said. I slipped the drive into my pocket. It felt heavy against my hip. I left the office and walked back to my car. The city was waking up. People were rushing to lunch, worrying about emails and deadlines. They had no idea that a war was being fought right above their heads. A war fought with paper and silence. I sat in my car and waited. At 11:45, my phone buzzed. It wasn't a text. It was a notification from the Meridian Secure app. Transaction complete. Asset transfer verified. Winter Hallow Holdings is now the primary lien holder for parcel ID 0442900 and associated commercial notes. I stared at the screen. It was done. I owned the roof over their heads. I owned the land under their feet. I owned the debt that was crushing them. And they had absolutely no idea. I put the phone down and started the engine. The engine roared to life. A deep guttural growl that vibrated through the chassis. I drove out of the garage and turned north toward the highway toward Maple Glen. As I drove, I thought about the script they had written for tonight. The Family Legacy Awards. They were expecting a victim to walk through the door. They were expecting a punching bag. I smiled. But there was no humor in it. They were about to meet the landlord. The phone in the center console began to ring just as I passed the city limits of Columbus, heading north. I did not need to look at the screen to know who it was. The ringtone was the default jarring electronic trill I had assigned to the landline at the Hawthorne estate. For 20 years. That sound had triggered a Pavlovian response in me. A sudden spike in cortisol. A tightening of the throat. A desperate mental cataloging of apologies for sins I had not committed. Today. However, the sound was just a sound. It was simply a vibration of air molecules devoid of any power over my pulse. I tapped the speaker icon on the dashboard screen. Where the hell are you? My father's voice filled the cabin of the sports car. It was not the smooth baritone modulation he used for clients or the fake jovial boom he reserved for the country club locker room. This was the raw, jagged voice of Gerald Hawthorne when he felt control slipping. It was the voice of a man who had expected a punching bag and found only empty air. Hello. Father, I said. My voice was calm, pitched low to cut through the static of his rage. I assume you are calling to ask if I arrived home safely last night. Do not play games with me. Chloe, he snapped. I could hear the background noise of the house, the clinking of silverware, the hum of the television. They were likely having lunch, fueling up for the performance tonight. You walked out of dinner. You left without a word. Your mother was mortified. Do you have any idea how disrespectful that is? We are trying to help you. We are trying to include you in this family, and you treat us like I did not leave without a word. I interrupted. I kept my eyes on the highway, the gray asphalt stretching out like a ribbon of possibilities. I left because I had preparations to make and because I wanted to leave you a gift. There was a pause on the line. The silence was thick. Confused. Gerald Hawthorne did not understand gifts that did not come with a tax write-off or a plaque. What are you talking about? He demanded, suspicious now. The rectangular package wrapped in brown paper. I said. I left it on the entryway table last night behind the vase of hydrangeas. I noticed it was still sitting there when I left. You must have missed it in your distress over the safe. I let the mention of the safe hang in the air for a second. A small needle pricked before the knife. I am standing in the hall right now. Linda's voice piped up from the background. She must have been listening on the extension or standing close to Gerald. I see it. It is heavy. Open it. I said. We do not have time for this. Gerald grumbled. Tessa needs the bathroom for her makeup team, and I have to open it. Dad. I said it wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with such icy precision that it stopped him mid-sentence. I heard the rustle of paper. I could visualize the scene perfectly. The expensive foyer with the marble floors. The light streaming in through the transom window. Gerald holding the phone against his shoulder. His other hand tearing at the butcher paper. Linda hovering nervously. Tessa probably leaning against the door frame. Bored. Checking her nails. I heard the cardboard lid being lifted. Then silence. It wasn't the silence of confusion this time. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a ghost entering the room. Do you recognize it? I asked softly. I knew he did. I knew every inch of that image because it was the only thing I had ever made that was truly mine. It was a graphic rendering I had done at 17. A mixed media piece using charcoal and digital overlays. It depicted a girl standing in the middle of a crowded, chaotic dinner party, but she was translucent. You could see the wallpaper pattern through her chest. You could see the chairs through her legs. She was fading away pixel by pixel while the people around her, figures that looked strikingly like Gerald and Linda, were vibrant, solid, and laughing with mouths that were too wide, too full of teeth. I had called it the vanishing point. This Linda's voice was a whisper, trembling. This is you tore it up. I said. August 14th, 1999. I brought it to you in the study. I wanted to show you I had been accepted into the summer design program. You did not look at the acceptance letter. You looked at the drawing. You took it from my hands. I could hear Gerald breathing. It was a ragged, shallow sound. You called it morbid trash. Continued. Reciting the words that were etched into the marrow of my bones. You said, stop wasting your life on this depressing garbage and learn to be useful. And then you tore it in half. And then in quarters. You dropped the pieces on the rug and told me to vacuum them up before your client arrived. Why are you doing this? Gerald asked. His voice was lower now, stripped of its bluster. He sounded unsettled. That was 20 years ago. Chloe. Why bring up ancient history? Look closer. Dad, I said. Look at the tear marks. I imagined him, leaning in. The piece had been framed in museum-quality glass, but the scars were visible. The paper had been meticulously reassembled, piece by jagged piece, but I hadn't hidden the damage. I had asked the restoration expert to highlight the seams, to use a gold-fleck adhesive in the style of Japanese kanugi, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold to emphasize the beauty of the break. The jagged lines running through the girl's translucent body now shimmered. The violence he had inflicted on my work had become the veins that held it together. How? Linda asked. I thought you threw it away. I did. I said. I put the pieces in the kitchen trash can and I cried in the pantry for an hour. But I wasn't the only one in the house that day. Mrs. Delaney. Tessa said. It was the first time she had spoken. Her voice lacked its usual condescending lilt. She sounded shocked. Mrs. Delaney fished every single scrap out of the garbage. I told them she ironed them flat. She kept them in a shoebox under her bed in the servants' quarters for 15 years. When I started my own company, she mailed them to me. She wrote a note. She said, "Some things are too important to stay broken." I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. But my voice remained steady. I had it restored. Dad, I had it framed, and I'm giving it back to you. I want you to hang it in the living room tonight. We are not hanging this, Gerald shouted, the anger returning as a defense mechanism against the shame. It is hideous. It is an insult. You think you can just send this accusation to my house on the day of the party. It is not an accusation, I said. It is a reminder. You spent my entire life trying to tear me into pieces that were small enough to fit into your world. You wanted me to be the invisible girl in that picture. But you failed. The gold holding that paper together. That is what I made of myself after you were done destroying me. You are ungrateful. Gerald spat. After everything I provided. You provided a roof and a lesson. I cut in. The lesson was that if I wanted to survive, I had to be stronger than the person trying to break me. Thank you for that, Gerald. It was the most valuable thing you ever gave me. Don't you dare talk to me like that, he roared. You get your ass over here right now. If you are not here by 6, do not bother coming at all. I will cut you out. I will. I tapped the red button on the screen. The line went dead. The silence that filled the car was immediate and absolute. It was not empty silence. It was the silence of a heavy weight being dropped after a lifetime of carrying it. I had hung up on Gerald Hawthorne. I had cut off the voice that had dictated my self-worth for 4 decades. I did not feel fear. I felt a strange vibrating lightness in my chest. A second later, a soft chime sounded from the dashboard. A notification banner slid across the navigation screen. Meridian Secure Alert transaction finalized. Asset ID. Hallmort distressed. Status acquired. Owner of record Winter Hallow Holdings LLC. I pulled the car over to the shoulder of the highway. I needed a moment. I put the car in park and looked at the screen. The numbers were crisp and white against the dark background. 2,840,000. That was the price of the chain I now held. I looked out the window. To my right, the skyline of Columbus was fading in the distance. To my left, the rolling hills of Ohio winter lay covered in a thin gray frost. The world looked exactly the same as it had 5 minutes ago. The trees were still bare. The sky was still the color of slate. But the physics of my universe had shifted. Gravity had moved for years. I had believed that power belonged to the person who could shout the loudest. I thought it belonged to the man who sat at the head of the table. The man who carved the roast. The man who opened the safe. I thought power was fear. I was wrong. Power was not noise. Power was ink on a page. Power was a signature on a digital document stored on a server 3 states away. Power was the ability to stand still while the other person exhausted themselves screaming. My father was currently standing in his foyer, red-faced, holding a framed picture of his own cruelty, shouting into a dead phone. He thought he was in charge because he was loud. He did not know that the ground he was standing on, the marble floor, the foundation, the very dirt now belonged to the daughter he had thrown away. The phone rang again. Gerald Hawthorne. I watched the name flash on the screen. It rang for 30 seconds. Then it stopped. 10 seconds later, it rang again. Linda Hawthorne. I watched it ring. Then Tessa Hawthorne. The car was filled with the electronic pleading of a family that suddenly realized they had lost control of the narrative. They were calling the old Chloe. They were calling the girl who would apologize. The girl who would rush back to fix things. The girl who would beg for forgiveness for being difficult. But that girl was not in the car. That girl was gone. glued back together with gold and hardened into something unrecognizable. I reached out and pressed the Do Not Disturb button. The ringing stopped instantly. I put the car back in gear. The engine purred. A deep throaty sound of unleashed potential. I checked the time. It was 4 o'clock. I had 2 hours to get to Maple Glen. Check into a hotel to change and prepare for my entrance. I merged back onto the highway. The road ahead was clear. I was not going home to be a daughter. I was going home to be a consequence. I checked into the boutique hotel on the outskirts of Maple Glen at 4:30 in the afternoon. The room was sterile and beige. A perfect blank canvas for the war room I was about to construct. Placed my phones, both of them, on the desk and watched as the screen of my personal device lit up. It started with a single vibration, then another. Then a continuous angry buzz that rattled the oak veneer of the table. I did not answer. I simply unlocked the screen and opened the source of the noise, the Maple Glen Community Connection Facebook group. It was a closed group, 2,000 members strong, comprising the town's elite, the aspiring elite, and the busybodies who fed on the scraps of gossip falling from the tables of the first two groups. My mother was an administrator. There, pinned to the top of the feed, was a post from Linda Hawthorne. It had been uploaded 20 minutes ago. Dear friends and neighbors. It began. I could hear her voice in the syntax, the breathy, victimized tone she perfected over Chardonnay. As many of you know, tonight is our annual Christmas gala. We are so excited to celebrate with you. However, Gerald and I ask for a little grace this evening. Our eldest daughter, Chloe, has decided to join us this year. We love her dearly. But as some of you know, she has been going through a very difficult period of instability and financial struggle. If she seems withdrawn or makes any unusual comments tonight, please understand it comes from a place of deep personal pain and jealousy over her sister's success. We are just praying that bringing her back into the fold will help her find her way. Please be kind to her even if she is difficult. It was a masterclass in character assassination. In one paragraph, she had painted me as mentally unstable, broke, and envious. She had preemptively discredited anything I might say or do. If I defended myself, I was difficult. If I cried, I was unstable. If I stayed silent, I was withdrawn. She had built a cage of words and locked me inside it before I had even put on my shoes. The comments were already rolling in. So brave of you, Linda. Addiction is so hard on families. I had never touched a drug in my life. We will keep Chloe in our prayers. Hopefully, Tessa's example will inspire her. Is she the one who dropped out of art school? Such a shame. Then the direct messages started hitting my inbox. People I hadn't spoken to since high school. People who had ignored me for 2 decades. Suddenly felt the urge to reach out. Hey, Chloe. Just saw your mom's post. If you need a place to crash, my cousin has a basement apartment for rent. Cheap. So brave of you to show up tonight. Ignore the haters. Did you really ask your dad for $10,000? That is what I heard at the salon. I sat there watching the digital poison spread. My father was not just content to embarrass me in the room. He wanted to ensure that even if I walked out, I would have no reputation left to salvage in this town. He was salting the earth. My secure line rang. It was Margaret. I see the post, Margaret said without preamble. Her voice was clipped. My paralegal just sent me a screenshot. This is defamation. Chloe. It is liable. Per se. They are implying mental illness and financial insolvency, both of which are demonstrably false and damaging to your professional reputation. I can have a cease and desist letter delivered to the venue within 30 minutes. I can threaten an injunction. No, I said. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the parking lot where my black sports car sat like a dormant beast. Chloe. This is damaging, Margaret argued. If a client sees this, they will see a desperate family flailing. I said, if I send a cease and desist letter now, I look defensive. I look like I'm panicking. I look like the unstable daughter they just described. So, you are going to let them lie about you. I am going to let them feel safe. I replied. Right now, Gerald and Linda are high on their own supply. They think they have won the narrative. They think I am cowering in a hotel room crying over Facebook comments. Arrogance makes people sloppy. Margaret, I need them sloppy. I need them to feel so secure in their victory that they do not check the locks on the back door. It is a risky strategy, Margaret warned. It is the only strategy, I said. Let the town talk. Let them pity me. It will make the silence that comes later much more profound. I hung up. I did not reply to a single text. I did not comment on the post. I let the rumors ferment. Instead, I made a call to a private security firm in Columbus, a company I use for corporate espionage protection. I need a team of 4. I told the dispatch officer. Low profile. Black suits.
No arpieses visible.
I do not want you to look like bodyguards. I want you to look like event staff or guests. What is the objective? Jones the officer asked extraction protection documentation. I said I want high-definition audio and video recording of the stage area. I want witnesses who are not related to me. And if things get volatile, and they might, I want a secure perimeter around me. My family does not hit with fists. They hit with mobs. I need you to make sure I can walk out the door when I'm done. We can have a team there at 6 o'clock. The officer confirmed. $3,000 for the night. Make it $5,000, I said. And tell your men that if anyone tries to touch me, even if it is my father, they are authorized to intervene. Understood. I hung up and turned to the bed. I had brought a garment bag with me, but I hadn't unzipped it until now. Linda had told me not to look thrift store chic. Tessa had told me to look decent. I unzipped the bag. Inside hung a suit made of midnight blue silk tailored in Milan. It was severe, elegant, and screamed money, but only to people who knew what money actually looked like. It had no sequins, no logos, no flash. It was the kind of suit a woman wore when she was about to merge a company or bankrupt a competitor. I dressed slowly. I pulled my hair back into a tight, low bun. I applied makeup that was sharp and defined. No soft blushes. No pink lips. I looked like a blade. I checked my escape route on the hotel map. I checked the gas level in the car via the app. I was treating a family Christmas party like a tactical extraction from a hostile nation because in reality, that is exactly what it was. 5:45. My burner phone buzzed. It was a text message from a number I didn't recognize. No name. Just a video file attached. I sat on the edge of the bed and pressed play. The video was shaky. Likely filmed from a phone propped up on a cleaning cart or held partially behind a curtain. The angle showed the Hawthorne living room, the one with the pristine white carpets I was never allowed to walk on with shoes. Gerald and Tessa were sitting on the sofa. They were laughing. It wasn't a nice laugh. It was a wet conspiratorial sound. Do it again, Gerald said, swirling his scotch. Do the face she makes. Tessa stood up. She hunched her shoulders, made her eyes go wide and vacant, and clasped her hands together in a parody of nervousness. Oh. Thank you. Daddy, Tessa squeaked, pitching her voice high and trembling. I am just so honored to get the participation trophy. Can I have some money for rent now? Gerald roared with laughter, slapping his knee. That is perfect. And then I will say, Chloe, we got you this box to put your dreams in since they are too small to fit anywhere else. Tessa dissolved into giggles. And then we open it and it is empty. God, her face is going to be priceless. Do you think she will cry? I hope so. Gerald said. Taking a drink. She cries. The whole room will see how unstable she is. Proves my point. We win either way. She looks weak. We look like saints for tolerating her. The camera pans slightly, catching Mrs. Delaine's reflection in a mirror in the hallway. Her face was stone. She held the phone steady for another second. Then the video cut to black. I stared at the black screen. My hands were not shaking. My heart was not racing. I felt a cold metallic calm settle over me, like a layer of frost sealing a lake. They weren't just reacting to my failures. They had scripted my pain. They had rehearsed my humiliation like a vaudeville act. They were eager for my tears because my tears were the currency they needed to buy their reputation back. I typed a reply to the unknown number. Thank you. Tonight. The truth will speak for itself. I deleted the message from my outbox. But I saved the video. I forwarded it to the secure server at Meridian. Then I forwarded it to a second email address. The email of the audiovisual technician my assistant had identified on the event vendor list earlier that day. I made one final call. Meridian Operations. This is Sarah. My executive assistant answered. Sarah. It is Chloe. I said. We are moving to phase 2. Did you get access to the venue's projection system? Yet. Jones, Sarah replied. Her voice efficient and crisp. We bought the access code from the freelance AV guy for $500. He thinks we are planning a surprise anniversary slideshow for your parents. He gave us full remote mirroring rights. Good, I said. Load the file I just sent you. Queue it up. I want it ready to deploy on my signal. What is the signal? Sarah asked. When I say the word finish, I said. When I say I came to finish this, you override their feed. Understood. We are standing by. I stood up and walked to the full-length mirror. The woman staring back at me was not the Chloe who had hidden in the kitchen last night. That woman had been hurt. That woman had been reactive. The woman in the mirror was the CEO of a firm that dismantled failing entities. And the Hawthorne family was a failing entity. I picked up my clutch. I checked for the flash drive Margaret had given me. It was there. Cold and hard. I checked the time. 6 o'clock. The sun had set. The wolves were waiting in the banquet hall, licking their lips, ready for the sheep to walk in. I walked out of the hotel room. I did not slam the door. I closed it gently with a soft, definitive click. The Maple Glen Civic Hall was a structure built on pretension, much like the people currently occupying it. It was a cavernous building of red brick and white pillars, designed to look historic, but actually constructed in the 90s. Tonight, it was ablaze with light. A massive banner hung above the main portico, illuminated by spotlights that cut through the winter darkness. It read in gold lettering that was slightly too large to be tasteful. The annual holiday gala sponsored by the Hawthorne family. I sat in the back of the hired sedan watching the valet line move. It was 7:45. The party had officially started at 7. The invite said cocktails at 6:30. By arriving now, I was ensuring two things. First, that everyone had arrived, settled in, and consumed at least 2 drinks, lowering their inhibitions and raising their appetite for drama. Second, I ensured that they had all seen my mother's Facebook post. They had spent the last hour whispering about the unstable daughter, sharing pitying looks, and checking the door to see if the family failure would actually show up. I was not late. I was right on time. We are here. Jones, the driver said. Wait 1 minute, I instructed. I looked out the tinted window. I saw the security team I had hired. They were perfect. 4 men in dark suits standing near the entrance, blending in with the smokers and the drivers. They looked like guests who had stepped out for air. But I saw the way their eyes scanned the perimeter. One of them caught my eye through the glass and gave a barely perceptible nod. The perimeter was secure. Go, I said. The driver pulled up to the curb. The valet opened the door. The air was freezing, biting at my exposed skin. But I didn't flinch. I stepped out onto the red carpet that had been rolled out over the concrete. The midnight blue silk of my suit caught the light. It rippled like liquid steel. I buttoned the jacket, a single sharp movement, and walked toward the double doors. The noise of the party spilled out before I even entered, a cacophony of laughter. The clinking of crystal and a jazz band butchering Santa Baby. I pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The effect was instantaneous. It started with the people nearest the door. They turned, glass in hand, ready to greet a latecomer. Their smiles froze. Then the silence rippled outward like a shock wave. It moved from the entrance through the cocktail tables all the way to the stage. Even the band seemed to sense the shift in atmospheric pressure. The saxophone player missed a note, creating a jarring squeak that echoed in the sudden quiet. They were expecting a wreck. They were expecting the Chloe described in the Facebook post. Frayed, anxious, dressed in something cheap and ill-fitting, eyes darting around in search of approval or money. Instead, they got me. I stood tall, my posture perfected by years of boardroom warfare. The Italian silk fit me like a second skin. My hair was pulled back so tight it highlighted the sharp angles of my face. I wore no jewelry except for a pair of diamond studs that were small, real, and worth more than my mother's entire collection of costume pearls. I did not look down. I did not fidget. I scanned the room with a cool, detached amusement. I saw the whispers die in their throats. I saw the confusion cloud their eyes. This was not the narrative they had been fed. Is that Chloe? A woman to my left whispered. It was Mrs. Gable, the town gossip. She looked at my shoes.
Dimichu.
Current season. And then back at my face. She looked like she had just swallowed a lemon. I began to walk. The crowd parted. It wasn't out of respect. Not yet. It was out of sheer bewilderment. I moved through the room like a shark swimming through a school of ornamental fish. Chloe. The voice was sharp, breathless. I turned slightly. Tessa was standing near the ice sculpture. She was wearing a red sequin dress that was cut too low and fit too tight. It was flashy. It was loud next to my severe dark tailoring. She looked like a frantic ornament. She was staring at me, her mouth slightly open. She looked at my suit. She knew fashion. She knew exactly what I was wearing. And she knew that I couldn't afford it on a receptionist's salary. The cognitive dissonance was making her twitch. "You are late," she hissed, stepping into my path. Her eyes darted around, checking who was watching. "And what are you wearing? You look like a funeral director." "Hello, Tessa," I said. My voice was calm, projecting just enough for the people around us to hear the steady timbre. "You look festive. Very sparkly. Dad is furious," she whispered, leaning in. The smell of cheap champagne on her breath. He almost canceled the speech. "You were supposed to be here for the photos. You ruined the timeline." "The timeline has changed," I said simply. I stepped around her. I didn't shove her. I didn't need to. I just moved with enough purpose that she instinctively stepped back to avoid being run over. "Chloe." My father materialized from the crowd. Gerald Hawthorne looked impeccable in his tuxedo. His face flushed with alcohol and adrenaline. He moved to block my path, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. His grip was tight, bordering on painful. It was a hold meant to control, to steer. "You have some nerve," he muttered through a clenched smile, waving at a passing councilman with his free hand. "Walking in here like you own the place after the stunt you pulled with that picture. Where did you get that suit? Did you steal it?" I looked at his hand on my shoulder. Then I looked at his eyes. "Remove your hand, Gerald," I said. I didn't shout. I spoke in the tone I used when firing a senior executive. It was flat, final. and devoid of fear. He blinked. He was so used to me shrinking, to me apologizing that the command didn't register at first. "Excuse me," he sputtered. I said. "Remove your hand," I repeated. "Unless you want a scene right here in front of the mayor." I tilted my head toward the security guard standing 10 feet away. The guard took a single step forward. He was a large man built like a vending machine, and his eyes were locked on my father. Gerald followed my gaze. He saw the guard. He saw the cold calculation in my eyes. He realized with a jolt of genuine fear that he did not know the woman standing in front of him. He dropped his hand. "You just wait," he hissed, backing away. "You just wait until I get that microphone. I am going to bury you. Chloe. I am going to make you wish you had never come back to this town. I am counting on it," I said. I walked past him. I made my way to the front of the room near the stage. I saw my Aunt Nora sitting at table 2. She was my mother's sister. But she had none of Linda's cruelty. She looked frail, wrapped in a velvet shawl. When she saw me, her eyes widened. "Chloe," she breathed. I stopped and leaned down, kissing her soft, wrinkled cheek. "Hello, Aunt Nora," I said gently. "You look," she searched for the word, her hand gripping my wrist. "You look strong." "I am," I whispered. "Don't worry about what happens next. Just watch." I straightened up. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flash of gray uniform near the catering entrance. Mrs. Delaney was standing there holding a tray of empty glasses. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She simply looked at me and touched her left earlobe. It was the signal. The audio feed was patched. The video was cued. I gave her a single, slow blink of acknowledgement. Then the lights in the hall dimmed. A spotlight hit the stage. The jazz band faded out. A hush fell over the room, the kind of silence that is hungry for entertainment. Gerald Hawthorne walked onto the stage. He had recovered his composure. He adjusted the microphone stand, flashed his signature blinding white smile, and spread his arms as if to embrace the entire room. "Welcome. Welcome. Friend. Neighbors. And esteemed guests." His voice boomed, rich and syrupy. "Thank you for joining the Hawthorne family on this beautiful Christmas Eve. We are so blessed to have you all here." The room applauded politely. "You know," Gerald began, his voice dropping to a more intimate storytelling register, "Christmas is about tradition. It is about legacy. It is about the values we pass down to our children. And as a father, I know that path is not always straight." He paused for effect. He looked down at his wife, Linda, who was dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief in the front row. It was a perfect performance. "We have had a challenging year," Gerald continued, sighing into the microphone. "I believe in transparency. I believe in being real with the people I love. And I love this town. Many of you know that our eldest daughter, Chloe, has struggled." The heads in the room turned. 200 pairs of eyes bored into my back. I stood near the wall, sipping a glass of sparkling water, my face a mask of polite interest. "She has had a hard time finding her footing," Gerald said, his voice dripping with faux compassion. "She has chased dreams that well. Let us just say they were not grounded in reality. She has made mistakes. She has stumbled. And as a parent, it breaks your heart. You want to save them, but sometimes you have to let them fall so they can learn to stand." He was good. I had to give him that. He was weaving a narrative where he was the long-suffering patriarch, the rock in the storm of my incompetence. "But we do not give up on family," Gerald declared, his voice rising with passion. "We do not turn our backs. We embrace the broken. We lift up the weak." There were murmurs of agreement in the room. Amen. So true. That is why tonight we wanted to do something special, Gerald said. He gestured to Tessa, who was standing in the wings holding a large, ornate box wrapped in gold paper. We have an award for Tessa for her incredible achievements in real estate this year. But we also have a recognition for Chloe. The room went deadly silent. This was it. The climax of the play. Chloe, Gerald called out, shielding his eyes against the spotlight to look for me in the crowd. Come up here. Honey. Come home. It was a summons. It was a command. He expected me to freeze. He expected me to shake my head and run out the back door, proving his point about my instability, or he expected me to walk up there with my head down, a sheep coming to the slaughter. I set my glass down on a nearby table. The sound of the glass hitting the coaster was sharp and distinct. I stepped away from the wall. I did not look down. I did not rush. I walked toward the stairs of the stage with a slow predatory grace. The click of my heels on the hardwood floor echoed in the silence. Click, click, click. I saw the confusion on Gerald's face deepen. He had written a script for a frightened girl in a thrift store sweater. He had not written lines for a woman in a $3,000 suit, who walked like she was inspecting a property she intended to demolish. I ascended the stairs. I walked to the center of the stage. I stood next to him. I was tall in my heels, almost eye level with him. I turned to the audience. I didn't shrink. I didn't cry. I looked directly at the camera crew I had hired, then at the neighbors who had liked my mother's Facebook post. I smiled. It was the smile of the executioner who has just sharpened the blade. I am here. Dad, I said, my voice projecting clearly even without the microphone thanks to the acoustics of the hall. I am ready for my award. Gerald faltered. He held the microphone, but for a second he forgot to speak. He looked at me. Really looked at me. And he saw the void in my eyes where his daughter used to be. He saw the cold, hard calculation of a stranger. The script in his head cracked. He was supposed to be the benevolent king, and I was supposed to be the beggar. But standing there under the lights, the visual was all wrong. I didn't look like a beggar. I looked like a judge. Well, Gerald stammered, his jovial mask slipping for a fraction of a second. Well, isn't this wonderful? Come on. Tessa. Bring the gift. Tessa walked out. She was holding the box, but her hands were shaking. She looked from Gerald to me, sensing the shift in energy. The air on the stage was thick with static electricity. The audience leaned forward. They didn't know what was happening, but they knew it wasn't the heartwarming family moment they had been promised. They smelled blood. I stood center stage, bathed in the white light, and waited for them to hand me the weapon they thought was a gift. Tessa moved toward me across the polished hardwood of the stage, her heels clicking a staccato rhythm that sounded like a countdown. In her hands, she held the box. It was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive presentation, wrapped in shimmering gold paper and tied with a bow so elaborate, it looked like a structurally impossible knot. The box was large, perhaps the size of a boot box, but the way Tessa held it suggested it was light, too light to contain anything of substance. The audience leaned in. The silence in the Maple Glen Civic Hall was thick, gelatinous. They were waiting for the punchline. They had seen the Facebook posts. They had heard the whispers. They knew this was the moment the unstable daughter was supposed to crack open her humiliation and weep for their entertainment. Gerald stood next to me, beaming. His smile was so wide it looked painful, stretching the skin around his eyes until it was translucent. He gestured for Tessa to hand it over. Go on, Chloe, he urged, his voice amplified by the microphone, booming into the rafters. Open it. We wanted to give you something that truly represents your potential. He put a heavy emphasis on the word potential, twisting it until it sounded like a curse. Tessa thrust the box into my hands. Happy Christmas, Chloe, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the sound system. Her eyes were dancing with malicious glee. Don't drop it. It is fragile. Just like you. I took the box. It was indeed light. I could feel the emptiness inside it shifting. I looked down at the gold paper. I looked at the tag that read to Chloe for the dreams that never quite took flight. The room held its breath. 200 people watched me. My mother, Linda, sat in the front row, clutching a napkin to her mouth, her eyes wide with a mix of terror and anticipation. She wanted this to be over. She wanted me to be humiliated so order could be restored. I looked at Gerald. He was practically vibrating with excitement. He wanted me to tear the paper. He wanted me to lift the lid and find whatever cruel joke they had planted inside a mirror perhaps, or an empty jar labeled ambition. He wanted the reaction shot. I smiled. I did not tear the paper. I walked over to the podium where the microphone was mounted. I placed the gold box gently on the slanted wooden surface. The thud was soft, but in the silence it sounded like a gavel striking a judge's bench. Gerald's smile faltered. He took a half step toward me. "Chloe," he warned, his voice low. "Away from the mic. Open the damn box. Don't ruin the blocking." I reached out and adjusted the microphone. I lowered it slightly to suit my height. I gripped the stand with both hands, leaning in until my lips were an inch from the mesh. "Thank you, Dad," I said. My voice was calm, clear, and utterly devoid of the tremor they were all expecting. "I will open this gift. Promise. But before I do, there is something I think we all need to see. Context is everything, isn't it?" I looked up past the blinding glare of the spotlights toward the darkened booth at the back of the hall. I couldn't see Mrs. Delaney, but I knew she was there. I knew the freelance technician was there, his finger hovering over the enter key of the laptop that controlled the massive projection screen behind us. "Hit it," I said for a second. Nothing happened. The air in the room grew tight. Gerald let out a nervous chuckle, stepping forward to grab the microphone from me. "All right, folks. It seems Chloe is a bit confused." Then the screen behind us exploded into light. The jazz band's logo disappeared, replaced by a shaky vertical video feed. The audio crackled through the massive speakers, raw and unfiltered. "Do it again." Gerald's voice boomed through the hall. It wasn't the polished baritone voice he was using on stage. It was the slur of a man 3 scotches deep into his own ego. On the screen, giant versions of Gerald and Tessa appeared. They were sitting in the Hawthorne living room. The date stamp in the corner of the video read, "Yesterday, 4:15 p.m. The audience gasped. It was a collective intake of air that sucked the oxygen out of the room on the screen. Tessa stood up. She hunched her shoulders. She made a grotesque, mocking face. "Oh, thank you, Daddy," the Tessa on the screen squealed, her voice high and grating. "I am just so honored to get the participation trophy. Can I have some money for rent now?" The real Tessa, standing 5 feet away from me on the stage, went rigid. The color drained from her face so fast it looked like a physical blow. She stared up at the giant projection of herself, mocking the sister she claimed to love on screen. Gerald threw his head back and laughed. It was a cruel wet sound. "That is perfect. And then I will say, Chloe, we got you this box to put your dreams in since they are too small to fit anywhere else." The video continued. Every word was crisp. Every sneer was high definition. "Do you think she will cry?" Tessa asked on screen. "I hope so." The digital Gerald replied. "If she cries, the whole room will see how unstable she is. Proves my point. We win either way. She looks weak. We look like saints for tolerating her." I stood perfectly still at the podium. I did not look at the screen. I looked at the audience. I saw the transformation happen in real time. 10 seconds ago, they had been a polite mob ready to watch a family tragedy. Now they were witnesses to a conspiracy. I saw Mrs. Scable cover her mouth with her hand. I saw the mayor frown and uncross his legs, looking uncomfortable. I saw my Aunt Nora sitting up straighter, a fierce vindication burning in her eyes. And then I saw the phones come out. It started with one person in the back, then another, then a dozen. Within moments, a sea of glowing rectangles was raised in the darkness. They were recording. The narrative had flipped. This was no longer a story about a failed daughter. This was a story about a wealthy, prominent family caught on tape plotting the psychological destruction of their own child. Gerald realized what was happening. He spun around, staring at the screen, staring at his own face, distorting in cruel laughter. "Turn it off," he screamed. He lunged toward the side of the stage, waving his arms at the tech booth. "Turn it off right now. It is a fake. It is a deep fake AI generated." He ran back to the center of the stage, grabbing the microphone stand I was still holding. His face was purple. Sweat was already beading on his forehead. "This is a lie," he shouted into the mic, his voice cracking. "This video is doctored. My daughter made this to slander me. She is sick. I told you she was sick." But his panic betrayed him. A man who is innocent stands confused. A man who is guilty screams. I didn't fight him for the mic. I simply stepped back, letting him have it. I let him scream. Every word he shouted, every vein that popped in his neck, only aligned perfectly with the cruel tyrant on the screen behind him. The video ended. The screen went black. The silence that followed was heavier than before. It was the silence of a courtroom after the verdict has been read. It was a joke. Tessa stammered. She didn't have a microphone. But in the dead quiet, her voice carried. She looked out at the audience, her eyes wide and terrified. She was searching for an ally, for someone to nod and say they understood. We were just venting. You know how families are. She looked at her friends at table 4. They didn't look back. They were looking at their phones, rewatching the clip, sharing it to Instagram, to TikTok. The Achievement Award winner was currently trending for all the wrong reasons. I stepped forward again. I moved smoothly, reclaiming the space Gerald had tried to occupy. I didn't need the microphone stand. I unclipped a small lapel mic from my jacket, one I had brought myself, synced to the house system by the same technician who played the video. I tapped it once. Thump. "It does not look like a joke, Tessa," I said. My voice was soft, reasonable. "It looks like a rehearsal." I walked over to the gold box, picked it up. "You wanted me to open this," I said to Gerald, who was now standing near the curtain, breathing heavily, looking like a cornered animal. "You wanted me to show the room what is inside. Shall we finish the performance?" "Don't," Gerald rasped. "Don't you dare. You said you wanted transparency, Dad." I reminded him. I pulled the ribbon. Gave way easily. I tore the gold paper. I lifted the lid. I tilted the box toward the audience. It was empty. Just as they had planned. Just as they had laughed about in the video. I dropped the empty box on the floor. It made a hollow cardboard sound. "He was right," I said, addressing the room. "The box is empty." But he was wrong about why. I walked to the edge of the stage. I looked down at my mother. Linda was no longer crying. She was staring at me with a look of absolute horror. She realized perhaps for the first time that the daughter she had sacrificed to keep the peace had returned as a warlord. "I did not come here tonight to cause a scene," I said, my voice steady. "I did not come here to ruin your Christmas. I came here because for 40 years this family has told a story about me. A story that I am weak. A story that I am a failure. A story that I need to be managed." I paused. I let the words sink into the velvet curtains. "You thought I came here to beg for a seat at the table?" I said. You thought I came here to accept your pity and your empty boxes. I turned to Gerald. He was staring at me, his hands clenching and unclenching. He looked smaller than he had 5 minutes ago. The air had gone out of him. But I did not come to join the play. Father, I said. I came to end the production. You are finished. Gerald spat, though the volume was gone from his voice. Get out. You have made your point. You embarrassed us. Congratulations. Now get out of my hall. Your hall? I asked. I smiled. It was a cold, sharp expression. That brings us to the second part of the evening, I said. I reached into the inner pocket of my midnight blue blazer. I pulled out the blue folder, the transfer documents for the mortgage, the deed, and the commercial lien. You see? I said, holding the documents up so the light caught the heavy bond paper. That video was just the prologue. It was just to show everyone who you really are. Now I am going to show everyone what you really own. Tessa took a step back. She recognized the look on my face. It was the same look I had worn when I left the house the night before. What is that? She whispered. This, I asked, tapping the folder against my palm. This is the receipts. Tessa. I turned back to the audience. That video was part 1. I announced. Now let us begin part 2. The room did not move. No one went to the bar. No one went to the restroom. They were paralyzed, caught in the gravity of the collapse. They knew instinctively that the domestic drama was over, and the slaughter was about to begin. I opened the folder. The sound of the stiff paper turning over was crisp, amplified by the lapel microphone I was still wearing. It was a dry, bureaucratic sound. The sound of a gavel hitting a block. The sound of a cage door clicking shut. What is that? Gerald demanded again, though his voice had lost its bluster. He squinted at the documents in my hand, trying to read the headers from 5T away. Is that company property? You stole company documents. These are not company documents. Gerald, I said. My voice calm, pitching it perfectly so it reached the back rows where the bankers and the investors sat. These are public records. Or at least they became public records at 11:45 this morning. I pulled out the first sheet. It was a notice of assignment of debt. This, I said, holding it up so the notarized seal caught the spotlight, is a confirmation from First Ohio Trust. It states that the primary mortgage on the Hawthorne estate, the house we are standing in right now, has been sold. Gerald laughed. It was a nervous, jerky sound. So, banks sell mortgages all the time. It is called bundling. You think you are smart because you know a little real estate terminology. They do sell mortgages all the time. I agreed. But usually they sell performing loans. They do not sell the debt of their valued clients to private equity firms unless that debt is toxic, unless it is distressed, unless the borrower has missed 3 payments in the last 6 months. The room went quiet. The air conditioning hummed, sounding like a distant aircraft. The wealthy residents of Maple Glen knew the language of money. They knew what distressed debt meant. It meant failure. It meant the facade was cracking. You are lying, Gerald hissed, stepping forward. We are current. We are flush. The debt was purchased, continued, ignoring him, by a private entity called Winter Hallow Holdings. I looked at him. I waited for the recognition to dawn. It didn't. He was too arrogant to check the names of the shell companies that were circling him. And who owns Winter Hallow Holdings? I asked rhetorically. I reached into the folder and pulled out the articles of incorporation. I turned the page to the line listing the managing member. I do, I said. The silence that followed was absolute. I bought your debt. Dad, I said. My voice devoid of triumph, heavy with simple fact. I bought the mortgage on this house. I bought the commercial lien on the dealership land. I bought the equipment financing for the new showroom you built last year. As of this afternoon, I am not your daughter. I am your bank. You. Gerald's face went from purple to a chalky, sickly gray. He looked at Linda. He looked at Tessa. He looked for a way out. You cannot afford that. You are a consultant. You drive a rust bucket. You are lying. The purchase price was $2,840,000. I stated clearly. Paid in full. Wire transfer confirmed. The notification is in your email right now if you care to check. I turned to the audience. I saw the faces of the people who had snubbed me for years. I saw the banker from Wells Fargo leaning forward, whispering to his wife. I saw the judgment shifting. They were no longer looking at a mental case. They were looking at a woman who had just dropped nearly $3 million in cash to buy her father's life. For years. I said, walking to the edge of the stage. This family has projected an image of perfection. The good china. The gold awards. The charity galas. But let us look at the balance sheet. I read from the paper in my hand. Refinanced in 2019. Refinanced again in 2021 to pull out equity for a vacation home. Refinanced a third time 6 months ago just to make payroll at the dealership. Stop it, Gerald shrieked. He lunged for me. But the security guard I had hired, the large man in the dark suit, stepped onto the stage. He didn't touch Gerald. He just stood there. A wall of muscle between me and my father's rage. Gerald stopped. Panting. His tuxedo tie askew. This lifestyle. I said. Gesturing to the opulent hall. The crystal chandeliers. The expensive catering. It is not funded by success. It is funded by debt. It is a house of cards built on high-interest loans and the desperate hope that no one looks too closely at the books. I will sue you. Gerald screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. I will sue you for breach of privacy. I will sue you for slander. You cannot just air my financial business in public. I am the creditor. I replied coldly. And this is a foreclosure warning. But if you want to talk about lawsuits, Gerald, let us talk about the loan application. I pulled out the second document. The one Margaret had warned me was a loaded gun. Line 14. I recited. Inventory valuation. You claimed the dealership held $3 million in assets to secure the loan. Gerald froze. The color didn't just drain from his face. It vanished, leaving him looking like a corpse propped up by a tuxedo. But the manufacturer audit from the same week continued. Holding up the second sheet, shows $1.2 million. You inflated your assets by nearly 200%. You lied to a federally insured bank to get the money to buy this status. Do you know what they call that? Dad? I didn't say the word fraud. I didn't have to. The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The lawyers in the room knew. The business owners knew. Gerald's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at the audience. He saw his friends, his golf buddies, the people he had tried to impress for 40 years. They were not looking at him with admiration. They were looking at him with the cold, assessing stare of people who realized they had been conned. That is a lie, he whispered. But it was weak. It was the whisper of a man who knows the handcuffs are already being sized. I turned to Tessa. She was standing by the podium, clutching her fake award box. She looked sick. She looked like a child who had wandered into a minefield. And you? Tessa, I said softly. I didn't know. She stammered, backing away. I just signed where he told me to. I didn't know about the numbers. You are the guarantor, I said. I have your signature right here. You pledged your condo. You pledged your future commissions. You pledged your entire financial life to back up his lie. Tessa's eyes widened. She looked at Gerald. Dad, what is she talking about? You said it was just a formality. You said the business was booming. Gerald didn't answer her. He couldn't look at her. "I foreclose," I told her, keeping my voice level. "I don't just take his house. I take yours. I take your car. I take every dime you have saved. You are tied to him. Tessa. You are drowning with him." Tessa dropped the box. It hit the floor with a clatter. She looked at her father with a dawn of horror. She realized that while she was playing the golden child, he had been using her as a human shield for his dead. "How could you?" she whispered to him. "You told me we were safe." I looked out at the room again. The atmosphere had shifted completely. 10 minutes ago, they were hungry for drama. Now, they were witnessing an execution. But it wasn't the bloody kind. It was the dry, brutal execution of status. "I did not come here to ruin you," I said, addressing my parents. I could have filed the foreclosure papers quietly on Monday morning. The sheriff would have been at your door by Wednesday. Then why? Linda spoke up. Her voice was trembling. She was gripping the back of the chair in front of her, her knuckles white. She looked at the papers in my hand with terrified awe. "Why do this here?" "Because you wanted a show," I said. "You wanted to drag me on stage and make me a spectacle to hide your own failures. So, I am giving you a choice." I walked over to the edge of the stage and crouched down, bringing myself eye level with my mother. "I do not want your house, Mom," I said. "I do not want to see you on the street. I do not want to see Tessa bankrupt, even though she deserves a wake-up call." "Then, what do you want?" Gerald rasped. He was defeated. He leaned against the proscenium arch, looking old and broken. "I want it to stop," I said. "The lies, the bullying, the posts on Facebook, the snide comments at dinner, the way you use me as a prop to make yourselves feel taller." I stood up and addressed the room, making sure my terms were heard by every witness. "Here is the deal," I announced. "I will restructure the debt. I will give you a payment plan you can actually afford. I will not report the inventory discrepancy to the authorities yet." I saw the relief wash over Gerald's face, but I raised a hand to stop him. "But there are conditions," I said sharply. "When you will issue a public retraction of everything you have said about me in the last week. You will tell this town the truth that I am successful, that I am independent, and that I have been cleaning up your mess. 2. I continued, ticking off a finger. You will step down from the daily operations of the dealership. You are running it into the ground, Gerald. I will appoint a financial controller to oversee the books. You don't spend a dime without my approval." "You can't do that," Gerald muttered. But there was no fight left in him. "It is my company. It is my collateral," I corrected. "And 3, I said, turning to Tessa. "You will apologize. Not a fake apology. Not a sorry you felt that way apology. You will admit that you and Dad planned this humiliation tonight because you were jealous and scared." The room waited. Linda looked at Gerald. She saw the man she had feared for 40 years. She saw the man who had controlled every aspect of her life, who had made her complicit in his cruelty. And she saw him now stripped of his power, held hostage by his own daughter's competence. Something in Linda broke, or perhaps something woke up. She looked at me. Her eyes were wet, but for the first time, they weren't vacant. They were pleading. They were saying, "Enough. Please just end it." "I accept," Linda whispered. "Linda," Gerald hissed. "Shut up." "Gerald," she screamed. The sound of her voice shocked the room more than the debt revelation. Linda Hawthorne never raised her voice. "I accept," she said again louder, looking at me. "We will do whatever you say. Just please. No more. I cannot take any more lies. I am tired. Chloe, I am so tired." Tessa was crying now. Real tears this time. She looked at her father with disgust. You leveraged my condo. You risked my home. I had to. Gerald pleaded. I did it for us. For the family brand. There is no brand. Tessa shouted. It is just debt. It is all just debt. I watched them turn on each other. It was tragic in a way. They were eating themselves alive. Papers do not fear lawsuits. Dad, I said quietly. And they do not care about your brand. They only care about who signed on the line. I closed the folder. The snap of the cover was final. The audience was silent. They were looking at me with a mixture of fear and respect. I had walked in as the family scapegoat. I was walking out as the matriarch. I had just hostile takeover of my own family. So I said, we have a deal on the money. I looked at Gerald. He was slumped against the wall. A king without a crown. But money is easy. I said, money is just math. We can fix the math. I took a step closer to him. But there is something else. Gerald. Something that isn't in the loan documents. Something you have kept buried for 20 years because you knew that if it ever came out, no amount of money could save you. Gerald looked up. His eyes went wide with a new kind of terror. The terror of the personal. The terror of the unforgivable. Chloe, he whispered. No. We had a deal. You said I wouldn't report the fraud, I replied. I said I wouldn't take the house. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket again. This time, I didn't pull out a legal document. I pulled out a plain yellowed envelope. It was old. The paper was brittle. It had my Aunt Nora's handwriting on the front. But this, I asked, holding the envelope up. This has nothing to do with the bank. This has to do with who you are as a human being. I looked at the audience. If you thought the debt was the secret, I told them, you were wrong. I turned back to my father. Shall we read the letter? Dad. The envelope felt brittle in my hands. The paper yellowed by the passage of 20 years. It was a physical artifact of a time before digital footprints. A time when secrets were kept in locked drawers and whispered in corners. I held it up, and in the harsh glare of the stage lights, it looked like what it was, a relic of a buried crime. Aunt Nora kept this, I said, my voice cutting through the thick, suffocating silence of the hall. She kept it because she knew a day would come when the truth would be the only currency left that had any value. I looked at Gerald. He was no longer the defiant patriarch. He was staring at the envelope with the eyes of a man watching a guillotine blade shimmer in the sun. He knew exactly what was inside. He had spent 2 decades believing it had been destroyed. This is not a bank statement, I told the room. This is a letter. And attached to it are the ledger sheets from the Maple Glen Youth Scholarship Fund from the year 2001. A collective gasp went through the room. The scholarship fund was sacred ground in this town. Every wealthy family donated to it. Every aspiring student relied on it. It was the heart of the community's self-image. In 2001. Continued. Opening the flap. Gerald Hawthorne was the treasurer of the fund. That was the year the fund mysteriously announced it could only support 3 students instead of the usual 10. The board cited market downturns. Everyone believed them. Why wouldn't they? Gerald was a pillar of the community. I pulled out the ledger copies. They were photocopies. Grainy but legible. But the market hadn't turned down. I said the money didn't vanish into the economy. It vanished into a private account in the Cayman Islands. $55,000. It was withdrawn in 3 installments over 4 months. And the account it went to was controlled by one person. I held up the wire transfer record. Gerald Hawthorne. Gerald made a noise. A strangled whimpering sound. He slumped against the podium, his legs giving way. He looked small. The tuxedo that had fit him so well an hour ago now hung on him like a costume on a scarecrow. He stole from the children of this town to pay for the expansion of his showroom. I said he stole from your families to build the glass walls he stands behind today. The audience was frozen. This was different from the debt. Debt was bad business. Embezzlement was a betrayal. I saw the mayor stand up, his face grim. I saw the banker turn his back on the stage. The illusion of the good man was not just cracked. It was pulverized. But that is not the worst part, I said, my voice dropping lower, becoming more intimate. Money can be repaid. Trust can be rebuilt. But what he did to keep this secret that cannot be undone. I pulled out the handwritten letter. It was written on stationery from the 90s. The ink faded to a soft blue. This is a letter from my mother, I said. Written to her sister Nora the week she found out about the theft. I looked at Linda. She was standing frozen near the edge of the stage, her hands clutching her elbows as if she were trying to hold herself together physically. She was trembling so violently that the sequins on her dress shimmered like water. Read it, I whispered to the room. But I didn't hand it to anyone. I read it myself. Dear Nora. I read, my voice steady, but heavy with the weight of the words. I found the papers. I know what he did with the scholarship money. I tried to tell him I was going to the police. I packed a bag. I was going to take Chloe and Tessa and leave, but he caught me. I paused. I let the silence stretch until it was painful. He told me that if I ever spoke a word of this to anyone, he would destroy me. He said he would use his lawyers to paint me as an unfit mother. He said he would claim I was mentally unstable. He said he would take the girls and I would never see them again. He has the money. He has the connections. I have nothing. I have no access to the accounts. I have no credit history. I am a prisoner. Nora, I have to stay. I have to be silent for the girls. If I leave, I lose them. So I will be the wife he wants. I will be the statue. But please keep this in case something happens to me. Keep this so that one day maybe the girls will know I didn't choose this. I folded the letter. I looked at the audience. There were no phones raised now. People were too shocked to record. This was the autopsy of a marriage. It was the revelation that the perfect wife was actually a hostage. He didn't just steal money, I said, looking at Gerald, who was now weeping openly, his face buried in his hands. He stole her voice. He weaponized her motherhood against her for 20 years. You all thought Linda Hawthorne was cold. You thought she was distant. You thought she didn't care about me. I turned to my mother. She wasn't cold, I said. She was terrified. Gerald looked up. His face was a mask of ruin. I never meant it was just a threat I wouldn't have. You did? Linda's voice rang out. It was a scream that had been held back for half a lifetime. Linda stepped forward. She walked past Tessa, past the empty gold box, and stood next to me. She didn't look at the audience. She looked at him. You check the odometer on my car every day, Linda said, her voice shaking with rage and grief. You gave me an allowance of $200 a week for groceries and demanded receipts for every penny. If I bought a coffee you didn't approve of, you screamed at me for hours. You told me I was stupid. You told me I was useless without you. She took a breath, a ragged gasping sound. And when Chloe started to show independence, Linda continued, tears streaming down her face. You told me that if I supported her, if I gave her one dime, you would cut us all off. You made me choose between my daughter's happiness and her survival. And I chose survival. I pushed her away so she would leave. I wanted her to leave, Gerald, because I wanted her to get away from you. She turned to me. Her eyes were raw. I am so sorry. Chloe, she whispered. I was so scared. I thought if I made you hate this place, you would run far enough away that he couldn't break you. But I broke you instead. I looked at my mother. I didn't feel a rush of warm forgiveness. The scars of her neglect were too deep for that. But for the first time, I felt understanding. I saw the chain around her neck. I saw the cage she had been living in. She hadn't been his partner. She had been his first victim. You didn't break me. Mom, I said softly. You just taught me how to fight in the dark. I turned my attention to Tessa. My sister was standing alone near the curtain. She looked destroyed. Her entire identity, the daddy's girl, the golden child. The success story had been built on the foundation of this man. And now she realized that the man was a monster and she had been his cheerleader. I didn't know, Tessa whispered, her voice sounding like a ghost. Mom, I didn't know he did that to you. You didn't want to know, I said to her. It was easier to look at the new cars and the ski trips and pretend everything was perfect. You signed the papers. Tessa. You validated him. You helped him keep the cage locked. Tessa covered her mouth. She looked at Gerald with a horror that was absolute. She realized that the love he had given her was just another form of manipulation, a way to isolate Linda and alienate me. He is done, I said. I looked toward the side entrance of the hall. The heavy double doors opened. Margaret Callahan walked in. She was not dressed for a party. She was dressed for a closing. She wore a charcoal suit and carried a leather briefcase. She walked through the silent crowd, the sound of her heels striking the floor with the rhythm of justice. She didn't look at the guests. She walked straight to the stage. She climbed the stairs and set the briefcase on the podium, right next to the microphone Gerald had used to lie to the town. She clicked the latches open. The sound was loud in the quiet room. She pulled out a stack of documents. They were thick, bound with legal clips. Mrs. Callahan, I said. Is everything in order? It is, Margaret replied, her voice cool and professional. She looked at Gerald, who was kneeling on the floor, sobbing quietly. Mr. Hawthorne, I have prepared a stipulation of settlement and a restructuring agreement. She laid the papers out on the floor in front of him because he was too weak to stand up. What is this? Gerald stammered, wiping his nose with his silk sleeve. This is your surrender, I said. I walked over and stood over him. This agreement states that you admit to the debt, I explained. It acknowledges the irregularities in the scholarship fund, which we will call mismanagement for now, provided you agree to the terms. If you sign this, Winter Hall Holdings agrees not to forward the embezzlement evidence to the district attorney. We agreed to a payment plan for the mortgage. Gerald looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. You won't tell the police. Read the rest, I said. Margaret pointed to the second section. It also includes a permanent restraining order regarding financial assets. Margaret said. You will surrender power of attorney over the dealership to a court-appointed trustee selected by Ms. Jones. You will surrender control of all family bank accounts to your wife, Linda Hawthorne. You will have no access to credit. You will have no access to the equity in the home. And I added, leaning down. It includes a behavioral clause. You will retract every word you said about me. You will issue a public apology to the town for the mismanagement of the fund. And you will repay every cent of that $55,000 plus interest from your personal pension. You will never threaten my mother again. If you raise your voice to her, if you attempt to intimidate her, the deal is void. And I send the evidence to the prosecutor. Do you understand? Gerald looked at the papers. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Linda, who was standing tall for the first time in 20 years. He realized he was alone. I can't sign this, he wept. It takes everything. I won't be a man anymore. You haven't been a man for a long time, Gerald, I said. You have been a bully with a checkbook. Now you are just a debtor. I pulled a pen from my pocket. It was a heavy, expensive fountain pen. I clicked the cap off. Sign it, I commanded. Or I call the police right now, and you leave this party in handcuffs. Gerald looked at the pen. He looked at the stunned faces of his neighbors. He knew there was no coming back from this. If he signed, he was neutered. If he didn't, He was a convict. He took the pen. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely hold it. He crawled forward slightly on his knees to reach the paper. It was a pathetic, groveling movement that made everyone look away in second-hand shame. He pressed the pen to the paper. He signed his name. It was a shaky, jagged scroll. Nothing like the arrogant signature on the fraud documents. Margaret stepped in immediately, pulling the papers away the second the ink touched the page. She checked the signature, notarized it with a stamp she produced from her pocket and handed the folder to me. "It is done," Margaret said. I took the folder. I held the deed. I held the confession. I held his freedom. Gerald stayed on his knees, head bowed, broken in front of the town he had tried to rule. Linda walked over to him. She didn't help him up. She just looked down at him with a gaze that was empty of fear. She turned to me and nodded. It was a nod of gratitude, but also of exhaustion. Tessa was sitting on the edge of the stage, her head in her hands, weeping silently. The room remained silent. They were waiting for me to leave. They thought the show was over. They thought I had won, destroyed the villain, and saved the day. But I wasn't done. I walked back to the microphone. I looked out at the faces of the people who had laughed at the jokes about me, the people who had excluded me, the people who had enabled Gerald Hawthorne for decades because he threw good parties. "You think this is over?" I said into the microphone. "You think because he signed a paper? The rot is gone." I looked at the banker. I looked at the mayor. I looked at Mrs. Gable. "He didn't do this alone." I said he did this because you let him. You took his money. You ate his food. You ignored the way he spoke to his wife. You ignored the rumors about the funds. You were happy to watch the show as long as it didn't cost you anything. I paused. The air in the room grew cold again. "I am not just restructuring his debt," I said. My voice hard as diamond. "I am restructuring this town's definition of consequence." I tapped the folder. "I have the ledger," I said. "And I have the list of every person who took a consulting fee from that scholarship fund to look the other way." The mayor went pale. 3 other men in the front row stiffened. "I am not finished," I said. And with those 4 words, I didn't just end a family drama. I started a revolution. The mayor shifted in his seat, his face the color of old parchment. The banker who had turned his back on the stage was now staring at his polished shoes, likely calculating the legal exposure of his past dealings with the Hawthorne family. I held the silence in the room for a moment longer, letting the weight of my threat regarding the scholarship fund settle on their shoulders like a lead blanket. "But the town is not my priority tonight," I said, lowering the folder slightly. "My priority is the structural integrity of this family, and right now it is condemned." I turned my back on the audience, dismissing them. They were no longer the jury. They were merely spectators to the sentencing. I looked at Tessa. She was still sitting on the edge of the stage, her red sequin dress pooling around her like spilled wine. Her mascara had run, creating dark, jagged tracks down her cheeks. She looked young, terrified. She looked exactly like I had felt when I was 17. And Gerald tore up my artwork. The difference was she had never learned how to glue herself back together. "Stand up, Tessa," I said. My voice was not loud, but it was absolute. She looked at Gerald, instinctively seeking permission. He was still on his knees, staring at the floor. A broken man who couldn't even save himself, let alone her. She realized then with a fresh wave of panic that the king was dead. She stood up. She was trembling. "You have a choice," I told her. "And it is a choice Dad never gave me." I walked over to her, closing the distance until we were standing face to face in the center of the stage. "You signed the personal guarantee," I reminded her. "Legally, I can seize your assets tomorrow. I can take your condo. I can garnish your commissions until you are living in a studio apartment eating ramen noodles. I can ruin your credit score so thoroughly that you won't be able to lease a car for a decade. Tessa flinched. Please. Chloe. I worked hard for that condo. It is all I have. You have it because he used you to get it. I corrected. But here is the choice. Option A. You continue to be his shield. You continue to lie for him, cover for him, and pretend that you are the golden child while you drown in his debt. If you choose that, I foreclose. I take it all. And I leave you to him. Tessa looked at Gerald. She looked at the man who had laughed about humiliating her sister, the man who had gambled her financial future without a second thought. An option B. She whispered. Option B. I said. Is a restructuring. You surrender the title of your condo to the trust one control. You keep living there. But you pay rent. Fair market value. You pay it to the trust. And that money goes toward paying down the principal on the fraud you helped facilitate. Her eyes widened. You want me to pay rent in my own house? It is not your house. Tessa. It is the bank's house and I am the bank. I said calmly. But in exchange, I do not destroy your career. I do not report your complicity in the loan fraud. You keep your license. You keep your job. But you start over. You learn what it actually costs to live when you aren't being subsidized by lies. I paused, looking deep into her eyes. But there is a condition. You cut the cord. You stop seeking his approval. You stop being his puppet. You become your own person. Or you lose everything. The room was silent. Everyone had expected me to crush her. They had expected me to relish the moment of stripping the spoiled sister of her luxury. Instead, I was offering her a lifeline, albeit a heavy one. Tessa looked at me. For the first time in her life, she wasn't looking at me with pity or disdain. She was looking at me with respect. As she choked on a sob, I don't know how to be alone. He always told me what to do. He told me I was special because I listened. He lied. I said you were not special because you listened. You were convenient. Being convenient is not the same as being loved. Tessa broke. It wasn't a pretty theatrical cry. It was a guttural sound of realization. She covered her face with her hands and nodded. I take option B. She wept. I don't want to be his shield anymore. I'm scared. Chloe. I am so scared. Good, I said. Fear keeps you sharp. I turned away from her and walked to the microphone stand one last time. I addressed the room. But my eyes were locked on the back wall, visualizing the future I was building from the rubble of this night. As for the Hawthorne estate, I announced, my voice ringing with finality, the party is over. Gerald looked up. His eyes bloodshot. You said you wouldn't take the house. I said I wouldn't evict you onto the street. I corrected. But this house, this shrine to your ego, it is done. I gestured to the grand hall, to the chandeliers, to the life they had faked. This property will be listed for sale on Monday morning. I stated. We will sell it quietly. We will sell it quickly. The proceeds will be used to pay off the Winter Hallow debt in full. The remaining equity, if there is any left after we clear the liens, will be placed in an irrevocable living trust. I pointed to my mother. The beneficiary of that trust is Linda Hawthorne, I said. Not Gerald. Linda. It will be used to purchase a modest, manageable home. A home with no mortgage. A home where the china is used every day. Not just for guests. Me? Gerald whispered hoarsely. What about me? You are a dependent, Gerald, I said coldly. You live there by her grace. If she chooses to keep you, you get a stipend. Enough for groceries. Enough for gas. But no country club dues.
Nota alertaxidos.
No donations to get your name on a plaque. You are emasculating me. He spat a flash of his old anger trying to ignite. I am liberating you. I countered. I am freeing you from the burden of pretending to be a king when you are just a man who is bad with money. You should be thanking me. I took a step closer to the edge of the stage. And one final condition, I said. Scanning the room. Making sure the gossips and the busybodies heard every syllable. The silence ends tonight. But the noise ends. 2. I looked at my parents. No more Facebook posts. No more prayer requests that are actually character assassinations. No more whispering in the grocery store aisle. If I hear one word, one single word that slanders me or distorts what happened here tonight, the deal is void. I leaned in, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that the microphone picked up perfectly. If you try to weaponize this community against me again, I will not come back with a contract. I will come back with an indictment. I will hand the scholarship fund ledger to the FBI. I will hand the loan fraud evidence to the federal prosecutor. And Gerald, you will not die in a modest home with your wife. You will die in a federal prison cell wearing a jumpsuit that you definitely did not choose. Gerald shuddered. He pressed his face into the floor, sobbing. Please. No more. Promise. Promise. I don't want your promise, I said. I want your compliance. I felt a hand on my arm. I turned. It was Linda. She wasn't looking at the floor. She wasn't looking at Gerald. She was looking at me. Her face was ravaged by tears. Her makeup destroyed. But she looked more beautiful than she had in 20 years because she looked real. She stepped up to the microphone. She didn't ask for permission. I need to say something, she said. Her voice was thin, shaking, but it gained strength with every word. The room watched her. The woman they had dismissed as a trophy wife as a shadow. I am sorry, she said. She didn't look at the audience. She looked directly at me. I am not sorry that we got caught. I am not sorry that the money is gone. I am sorry that I saw you burning, Chloe. And I didn't pour water on the fire because I was afraid the smoke would ruin the furniture. She took a shaky breath. I failed you, she confessed. The words echoing in the silent hall. A mother is supposed to protect her child from the monsters. But I married the monster. And then I let him convince me that you were the problem. I let him rewrite my memories. I let him turn me into a coward. And that is a sin I will have to live with for the rest of my life. She reached out and took my hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was desperate. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for forcing the door open. I didn't know how to get out. I looked at her hand in mine. It was the hand that had adjusted the flowers while I cried over my torn drawings. But it was also the hand of the woman who had written that letter to Aunt Nora, trying to save a piece of the truth for us. I didn't pull away. I squeezed her hand back. It wasn't forgiveness. Forgiveness is a long road. And we were only at the trailhead. But it was a truce. We will figure it out. Mom, I said softly. But he doesn't drive the car anymore. No, she said, looking at Gerald with a newfound steely resolve. He sits in the back. I released her hand and walked over to where the gold box lay on the floor. The potential award. The empty vessel they had meant to use to hollow me out. I picked it up. I told you it was empty, I said into the microphone. But that wasn't entirely true. I reached inside. Tucked under the bottom flap, taped down so it wouldn't rattle, was a single heavy index card. I had seen it when I first opened the box. But I had saved it for this moment. I peeled the tape off. I held the card up to the light. This is what they plan to read, I said. This is the script Gerald wrote for this moment. I read the words aloud to Chloe. A box for your achievements. We left it empty so you would have plenty of room to grow since you have filled nothing else in 40 years. The cruelty of the sentence hung in the air. It was petty. It was small. It was the kind of insult a high school bully thinks of. Not a father. Tessa let out a sharp cry of shame, turning her face away. Gerald didn't move. He wanted to read this while you all laughed, I said. He wanted to break my spirit so I would be pliable enough to control again. I took the card in both hands. Rip. The sound was loud in the microphone. I tore it in half. Then in quarters. Then into eighths. I kept tearing until the insults were nothing but confetti. I walked over to the edge of the stage where a small wastebasket sat near the podium. I dropped the pieces into it. They fluttered down. White flakes of hate that no longer carried any weight. Then I dropped the gold box into the trash can on top of them. I looked out at the audience one last time. Enjoy your dinner, I said. You came here tonight for a party. You came to see a show. But I didn't come for the food. And I didn't come for the applause. I adjusted my jacket, smoothing the midnight blue silk. I came to finish a cycle, I said. And it is finished. I didn't wait for a reaction. I didn't wait for applause. I turned and walked toward the stage stairs. Past Tessa, who was standing tall, wiping her eyes. I passed Linda, who was watching me with awe. I passed Gerald, who was still a heap of tuxedo on the floor. I stopped next to him for 1 second. I didn't look down. I spoke to the air, knowing he would hear me. You are retired, Gerald, I said, and you no longer define who I am. You never did. I walked down the stairs. I walked down the center aisle of the hall. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. No one spoke. No one touched me. They looked at me with a mixture of fear and reverence. The way you look at a natural disaster that has miraculously missed your house. I pushed open the double doors and stepped out into the cold night air. The wind hit my face sharp and clean. It smelled of snow and pine, not perfume and lies. My car was waiting at the curb. The engine was running. I got in. I didn't look back at the hall. I didn't look back at the banner. I put the car in drive and pulled away, leaving the wreckage of the past in my rear-view mirror, shrinking smaller and smaller until it was just a speck of light in the darkness. And then nothing. I was free. Thank you so much for listening to Chloe's story of redemption and justice. I would love to hear from you. Please comment below and tell me where you are listening from. I love seeing our community grow across the world. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the HOA Karen Vlog channel. Like this video and smash that like button so we can share this story with even more people. Until next time.